Welcome back to Recap. At the beginning of the film, a man named Richard is shown. He was playing a football match with his team. Then the player from the opposing team attacks him and drops him. Richard becomes very angry at this, and Richard also begins to beat him bitterly. For this reason, everyone there is afraid. Richard and his best friend Lisa appear in the following scene. As they were communicating with each other, Richard spirals out of control, turning into a werewolf and attempting to harm Lisa. Lisa runs away from there because she is afraid of him. When Richard wakes up the next morning, he learns that he killed his parents. As a result, Richard becomes very sad and sentimental and turns into a werewolf again. At the same time, his girlfriend Lisa reaches him, takes the police with her, and Richard flees. And the news goes viral that Richard has taken his parents' lives, and everyone is given an ultimatum that Richard is a deadly buoyant. He also killed his parents. Then police officers start looking for Richard. It is known that Richard cannot control himself on the night of the full moon. So he turns into a werewolf. He then finds out that he was adopted by his parents. Because Richard knows this, he is so embarrassed. Richard never thought so. Richard leaves later. He sees two boys hitting a girl on the way. Then this girl asks Richard for help. Richard asks the boys to leave the girl, but they ignore his warning and ask Richard to move away. He is angry when he hears this. He turns back into a werewolf. Now Richard kills these two boys. Seeing this, she is afraid and runs away from there. Afterwards, Richard moves to a bar where he meets a man named Joe, and Joe wasn't an ordinary man either, but a werewolf. Richard now knew that not only was he a werewolf, but that Richard couldn't control himself. He demands the same from Joe. While Joe asks him, "Don't your parents teach you this?" he reveals that he is an adopted child. He never saw his biological parents. Now Richard confirms that there are other people like him. Now he asks Joe for his real address, but Joe forbids him from revealing it. But as he leaves, he gives him a clue so Richard can take advantage of this place. Then he reaches the city. When he gets there, he goes to the local bar where everyone stares at him. When he goes to the bar owner named Angelina after taking the bear, he begins to attract her and asks Angelina about work. A boy appears there as he was talking to Angelina, and he starts misbehaving towards Richard, but he doesn't tell him anything in return and starts waiting for the boy. As he leaves the bar after all the customers have left, he attacks the boy who is left alone, and that boy runs away because he is afraid of him. And a man named John offers him to work as a farmhand on this farm. He accompanies Richard to his house. A man named Connor approaches and tells Richard that "You hit one of my men." Then John comes there and says to Connor, and he says, "He's my nephew, your men were at fault in the bar." When Connor knows this, he leaves the place. The next day, Richard discovers the corpse of a wolf, and John tells him that it was done by a wolf who hunted the animal for no reason. Then Richard meets a boy while moving to a bar. He says, "I am your second cousin." He asked him to avoid Connor, but Connor stared at them, who were standing far away. As he said this, the boy runs away from there. Connor's men capture him on the way, and he asks, "What information you provided Richard?" This boy tells Connor that "I told Richard to get out of this town, and I told him to stay away from Angelina." Then Connor says to him, "You also told Richard something about me because I also heard my name back then." Now Connor is begging this boy to escape. He threatens that "It would be good if you run away, otherwise we will hunt you down." Then all of Connor's men go into the forest and follow this boy. Richard hears that boy's voice as he returned. So Richard comes back to the forest too. Richard meets Angelina when he comes to the forest. Angelina tells him that Connor and his men are hunting a boy. When Richard sees Connor's men eating the anthropomorphic animals, Richard comes with her to Angelina's house and begins to see the same messages. Meanwhile, John's wife hugs him when she sees him. When Richard sees this, he is so amazed. John tells him that "Your mother is my sister's daughter, who is purebred." When Connor saw her, he started to like her. When she rejects his marriage proposal from Connor, Connor seduced her so that "You are the son of same Connor. That means Connor is your father." John also reveals to him that "Your grandfather had spread the news of your mother's death everywhere, but she wasn't dead. He had preferred to lock her in a room. He had done it so that Connor would never have access to your mother. He gave you to someone when you're born. Because of this, your mother committed suicide that same month. Connor became even deadlier after your mother's death. He turned more people into werewolves after biting them. Then he made a pack of werewolves. Now he bullies others with other werewolves, but such werewolves are weaker than purebred werewolves, and you are a purebred werewolf." This makes it clear that they are now looking for a purebred girl for Connor. After that, he will not harm anyone. Now Angelina was the only girl in the whole city who was willing to do that. and she herself wanted to surrender to Connor, and she tries to explain it to Richard too, and Richard tells her, "We're all like animals. I did too, killed my parents." Then Angelina tells Richard that my father returned home one night after getting too drunk and that he took my mother's life. When he woke up early in the morning, he was so devastated to witness this. At the same time, he committed suicide after cutting his throat. Now Richard asks her if it is power or a curse. Then Angelina tells him that if we get control of it, it will be nothing less than a blessing. Now Richard asks Angelina to stay away from him so he can't harm Angelina. But Angelina forbids him from doing so. Then at night, a pack of purebred werewolves gathers at John's house, and they all wanted Angelina to be given to Connor, but Richard forbids this. And he leads the force to face Connor alone. Now he says to Connor as he reaches him, "I am the son of the same women who were seduced by you." Connor tells him here that I gave you a chance like I offer to everyone. He asks Richard to escape from there. When Connor hears this, he becomes so aggressive. He sends all of his men after Richard, and Richard kills all of his men who reach the forest. Then Connor and his men surround him and begin to brutally beat him. Richard then screams loudly. Now Angelina also starts running into the forest when she hears Richard's calls. Now Connor wanted to go to Richard there. Richard then attacks him with his claws and runs away. Noticing that there is a deep ditch in front of him, Richard had no other option. Now Richard jumps into the ditch. As a result, he becomes so wounded. He then sees Joe, who encourages him to get up. Richard somehow moves into the forest after he gets up. There he meets Angelina, who takes him home. John then asks Richard to get up. He says it's just a way to recover, but Richard still can't get up. Then John gestures to Angelina and Angelina goes to Richard. This causes a change in Richard's body movement. Richard begins to recover. Afterwards, Angelina begins to take him outside and asks him to run away. Richard forbids it at first, but he runs while he regains his courage. His wounds are healed when he runs. Later, they both come to John. John is known to have a lot of explosives, and this is where Richard gets an idea. He begins making the bullets so the werewolves can be killed. As he placed the explosive material underground, he heard Angelina's voice. When he finds out at home that they have kidnapped John and Angelina, he finds out and calls Richard there. They had held Angelina there after chaining her. Now Richard kills the guard who gets there. Now he had completely transformed into a werewolf, and Connor's men start attacking him there. He kills everyone there one by one and runs into the forest after freeing Angelina from her trap. Now Angeline is killing everyone in this place too. She frees John from the cage and sends him to rescue Richard. Now they are waiting for Richard to come home. Connor's men also approach the house when Richard arrives and asks them to return. Hearing this, Connor is angry and asks his men to take Richard downstairs, but John starts shooting there. As a result, many of Connor's men met their end. At the same time, Connor hears Richard's voice in the direction of the farmhouse. When Connor and his men reach the farmhouse, Richard locks the farmhouse door and John starts shooting there, causing a large explosion. Now all of Connor's surviving men have also been killed, but Connor has survived and attacks Richard. Now Richard fights him and drops him. Then John wanted to fire his gun at him, but Richard forbade him. He reminds Connor that you have done many bad deeds and that's why you have to die. Then Connor tells him that I never wronged your mother. We were in love. When your grandfather spread the false news of your mother's death, I had lost my heart from that time on. Because I had great affection for your mother and that grief had made me a bad man. Then, the previous man, Joe, arrives, whom he had met at a local club. He tells that I already wanted revenge on Connor, but he was the reason for my banishment, but I could never defeat him. When my brother told me about Richard, I killed Richard's parents. This spread the news that Richard had killed his own parents, so Richard had to come to this city while he left his homeland. When Richard hears this, he gets so angry and starts beating Joe, and Joe beats Richard. As a result, he falls down. When Connor forbids him, Joe brutally slits his throat. Because of this, Connor also died on the spot. Now Joe tried to kill Richard too. Then Richard's uncle John saves him when he comes there, and while Joe starts running away from there, Richard then stopped him. Joe was smoking cigarette and Richard throws his cigarette on the ground and grabs it, and this spread explosive is set on fire. Now Richard himself goes far away from Joe. Because of the cigarette, the explosive material spread out is detonated and Joe comes to an end. In the next scene, we see that Richard and Angelina moved out of town. John gives them the list of the last surviving purebred werewolves. The names of those who were full-blooded werewolves were listed there, and the film ends with this scene. So, that's the end of our movie. If you've come this far, make sure to give a thumbs up and subscribe my channel. See you later.